Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Trishna Menon, and I lead the marketing at Circularize, and I'm thrilled to have you all join us today. So, let me quickly introduce who you will be hearing from today. Deborah is a managing partner at Trillium and one of the leading practitioners in circular supply chain design. Her career spans Microsoft, Gates Foundation, to name a few. There are lot more. Phil, it's written Philip there, but he goes by Phil. He's the head of sustainable innovation at Circularize. He works at the intersection of regulatory intelligence, technology strategy, and supply chain traceability. He's been deep in the DPP, that is Digital Product Passport implementation, for some time now. And Judith is now this is a mouthful, but in innovator community and circular economy ecosystem lead at the World Economic Forum. Judith will be our moderator today for the panel, and she'll be bringing in her own perspectives from the policy and ecosystem side. So, all the three here today are the co authors of the World Economic Forum article that was published back in March. And it puts forward a 5 point framework for deciding when transparency in circular supply chains is actually creating value and when it just adds cost. So today we'll be going well beyond the article and into the practical realities from the field. So here's how the next 1 hour will work. Deborah will open with the 10-minute of context setting for those who haven't read the article. And we'll then move into a panel conversation, which Judith will moderate. And then we'll close with a audience Q&A. Speaking of which, if you have questions at any point, please drop it into the Q&A tab at the bottom right side of your screen, hopefully. And you don't need to wait until the end, though. At any point of time, if you have a question and if it's relevant to the topic that the speakers are speaking about, they will answer at the time. And any extras, they'll take it at the end. And our speakers are more than happy to work through all of these questions with you. This session is being recorded, and we'll share a link with everybody who's registered afterwards. So just pay attention to what everybody's talking. No need to take any notes down. And also, to keep things interactive, you might see a poll pop up here and there, and as well as a few occasional questions from the speakers to get a better sense of who's in the room. So please do respond when they appear because it genuinely helps us shape the conversation. Anyway, all right, that's my time. Over to you, Judith.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Trish and the team for hosting us, bringing us together. We are exploring where the future of material and product data is heading. I couldn't find a better topic to spend my time. To kick us off, I'd like to share a bit of a story of how we got here. I think it sets the tone for everyone to join us in the discussion. At the end of last year, I heard Deborah on a podcast positioning the question, are DDPs overkill? When I heard that, I thought two things. One, what a brilliant marketing brain this woman is. And second, are they overkill? I don't know about you, but I learn best when people disagree. So then I reached out to Phil with the same question. Phil, are DDPs overkill? We ended up having a beautiful discussion. All three of us realized actually majority of what we think, our opinions actually align. We also felt that the global debate on DDPs could benefit from nuance to make them more usable in practice. And I think that's what we want to share as key takeaway for you today. Please respectfully, but please disagree with us. That's how we all learn. You can use the chat for your thoughts and the questions tab for your questions. And maybe to kick us off, we would really appreciate if you could share in the chat basically why you are here. What is an insight that you're looking forward to take away? When was this call useful for you? While you think of that and put it in the chat, happy to hand it over to Deborah, who will walk us through the 5 different ways of looking at product transparency that will undoubtedly change how we look at DDPs from now on. Deborah.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Judith. And thanks, everybody, for spending this hour with us. As you heard, I posed this question last year because as we think about what we know about products, for new products, we know very little. And this is mostly in part because our supply chains are just so darn long. For something simple like a t-shirt, there's often 6 stops or nodes or tiers between the planet and the shelf. So 6 for like a t-shirt, 20 for something like a car. So most of what's around you in your house right now falls somewhere in between. And one of the interesting parts about supply chain to me anyway is that nobody's in charge. So as these nodes feed each other, we know what we know, which is usually who's right before us and who's right after us. We don't often actually know who's up a few tiers. So that actually makes it very difficult for us to understand what makes up a product when it's brand new. Then when we go to reuse, we also often don't know who has used it to do what for how long, and has then a repair been done, etc. But in the circularity community, we often want to volunteer this information, I think, as a way to show that the product can be used again and can be trusted. For a couple of years, we had this discussion on barcodes. So we could put a barcode on a product and then we will know where it has been. These discussions over the last, I'll call it a decade since I first interacted with the circularity community, has grown into now service directive or directives from the EU and guidance on product passports and what that means. So we have, of course, in the EU, the battery regulation coming up, ESPR, different compliance pressures, in contrast, I suppose, with a deregulation in the US, but that's bound to have a pendulum swing. So in this, we think, in this article that we all put together, as Judith said, we really looked at what is this data used for? So let's imagine we could actually get all the information about any product, new or used. What would we do with it, and how would that change the operation behind getting that product back into use? And so we came up with this 5-tier model, we might call it. And I'll go through each of these so it makes sense, but you'll see 5 to 1, with 1 really being the most robust version of what many of us would consider a DPP, a digital product passport. And in each circumstance, we asked, how does this change what our teams, what operators, or what the users would do with that new information? So I'll go through each one, like I mentioned, and then give an example of each. And we'll keep this in mind then during the discussion. I'll put this up again at the end of our time together today. And I'm going to ask you, spoiler alert, which one makes the most sense for your world right now? So you can keep that in mind as we go through this. So for this first one, we call it velocity threshold. This is for very fast moving, high volume, commoditized often items. If you've ever been through a bottle return scheme, this is very common in most parts of the world. This would be a great example of when we see a lot of volume. So this is about what would I change if I knew what this bottle had in it or where it's been, or if it's a standard milk or beer or soda or water bottle, often it's washed and reused without asking where it's been. So here for each of these circumstances, we'll ask, what is the question that we would ask? So in this case, does documenting this improve margins, or does it just add overhead? And often, because there's such volume and because it's moving so quickly, we don't need to know very much about the bottle. Instead, in some cases, we know based on the bottle shape, for example, we know what goes inside. So then for each of these circumstances, we'll have an action. So in this case, we measure at a batch level so that we can plan our operation. And afterwards, we'll figure out if we need to make any infrastructure changes in order to redirect these resources into their highest value. One example of this, which is one of the bullets, is in the fast or semi-fast fashion. Many fast-ish fashion houses now have some sort of a pre-owned offering. And in this case, when a buyer buys a used Zara dress, they often want to know the condition, the size, and the price. They don't necessarily care where it's been or for how long, but they want to understand if it's useful to them right now. So this re-commerce data is important for them and has some version of a limited amount of transparency, as this is a high volume first circumstance. All right, on to the next. This is more about materials. We call it material truth. At the end of a use, we want to ask, how do I process this so that each of the materials can have its highest value? So instead of perhaps a reuse scheme, now we're starting to take something apart. So we want to understand what those materials are and then give that data to the operator. This might be mixed plastic, end of life or end of useful life vehicles, or in the example I'll give you now, an electronic. Apple famously developed something several years ago called Daisy, an autonomous robot that takes phones apart. It used to be that it didn't make any sense financially to take an iPhone apart to get the little tiny amount of gold that's left inside, but now they do. So Daisy has been now taught to disassemble 29 different iPhone models. It scans, it knows which model it is, and it starts to take it apart. The reason why this matters, for example, is you may or may not know, we're running out of some of the metals in the earth. We have less than 50 years of known mineable gold, for example. And so now all the gold is recycled, is reused out of these iPhones. iPhone 13 was the first one to be created with fully reclaimed gold. But who owned the phone and where it was and how long it was used for doesn't matter for Daisy to be able to take this apart. Instead, it's the understanding of where the pieces are so that Daisy can take it apart and the materials can be reused. The next circumstance is really about repair. So we had reuse, we had some recycling, and now we have a focus on repair. So now we do want to know what's been done before and what's the fastest path to fix whatever's in front of us. We'll take that repair history and give it to whatever technician will need to go and repair the item. This matters for industrial machinery. I'll give you an example of that next. And if there's any warranty guarantees that we've given to customers, and of course, much of the EV battery discussion is centered here. You may be familiar with Cat Reman, and if you imagine these big caterpillar, like an excavator that's out in a remote location and it breaks down. So they have a couple options. They can wait for it to fail completely, which isn't a great call. They can call in an expert to try to diagnose it, or they can try to do a prioritized service event, which shares data with the closest parts dealer to share what has happened with that machine before. And that's exactly what Caterpillar does. This speeds up the repair cycle. And so that item can be added to its highest value, which is, of course, the overall goal of the circular economy. All right, now we're at circumstance 2 of 5. We're working our way down, so we've covered 4. This is about network coordination. So how do we use a network effect to repair and triage and repair items as quickly as possible? So we do want to know what should happen to the item. So in the last one, it's what has happened. Now we want to know what should happen in order to make the best use of it. So this might be the condition. This might be a forward-looking pricing model, for example, around spare parts and reuse based on the market. And based on that, we will send the part or the product or the material to a different part of the network. We're starting to see some interesting spare parts sharing also, which speaks to this type of a concept. The example comes to us from Renault and their idea of a refactory. So when they get a vehicle into the refactory network, they have to make a decision. Does it go into the Renew factory for full reconditioning? They can send it to the bodywork factory for accident damage, or the remakers for component remanufacturing if it's just one piece like a gearbox that needs to be changed out, or is it really kind of beyond repair and it needs to go to recycle for parts? And this is where more history does help, so we can make the best out of each of the parts. But the full product passport, we're still not quite there yet. However, it is helpful to understand the infrastructure that this is being dropped into so that the operators can make the best decision. And last here, we have what we call liability handoff. And this is really where we want to truly know everything that's happened to this product because it's a safety issue. And this one might be with aircraft or major transportation items. And an example I'll give you, reused medical devices. And we want to know the information about this and then keep it with that item over time. In this case, when a hospital sends a device back to Stryker, they need to change it into what the FDA calls substantially equivalent to new. So it effectively becomes new again. And in order to prove that it is, they need to attach documentation digitally that says that, yes, there's a chain of evidence, this is what we've been doing. And if they don't, then that device is legally considered biohazard. So quite a dichotomy there between like new and a biohazard, and the documentation is what makes the difference. So we have this spectrum of information that helps us understand what do we do with this item and what can we do with this item. So what we'll dive into in this panel time is about pressure testing this framework about what we see in the real world. And again, asking ourselves, what will we do with the information? What do operators change if they had a new piece of information? And the reason we want to be careful here is, of course, digital information lives in the cloud. The cloud is a real space. The cloud is a hungry space. And so if we don't need to hold all that information about an item in the cloud, then we're actually more circular because we're allowing that server space to be used by somebody else. Judith, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Deborah, for walking us through the framework. Also in the chat, I see data transparency is often a question mentioned. And I think our message to all of you today is match that transparency to the decision it is meant to enable. It is a way for you to analyze, will this information change an operational decision? Because that is what will increase the circularity at the end. If the answer is yes, then invest in transparency. Maybe diving a bit deeper into that, Phil, can I kick it off with the first question for you? Deborah walked us through the 5 conditions. I'm curious how it holds up when you're actually in a room with one of your partners. Do companies ask whether the transparency investment will make a change for an operational decision? And also happy for people to share their experience in the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. And also thanks, Deborah, for putting together the succinct plan and slides and framework, because I think bringing this operational lens is critically important. Is it the first question that companies are asking? Actually, I think Gabriella in the chat has said what most companies are looking at as the first question, which is the compliance question, be it ESPR, be it battery regulation, CSRD or CSDDD, or any other acronym soup that we want to throw at it. This is kind of creating this panic-driven over-collection, I think, that Deborah is also highlighting. But actually, what we find when we're in the room and we start to pressure test that and ask companies to start thinking more about the data collecting and the purpose. Because again, if I'm going to collect information from X number of countries, collecting it from X number of clients down to granular levels, that's a big body of work. But this also, in my view, starts to miss some of the opportunities. So what we try to bring into the room is also some light bulbs around the question, okay, what are you trying to bring it to? Now, if it's very specific to a compliance issue, okay, you have to deal with the compliance issue. But why? What additional value can you have on that? What's the digitization strategy for the wider company? So, for instance, the discussion around remanufacturing that Deborah brought in for Caterpillar, you know, the automotive refactories, Toyota is also doing something similar. The question then comes down to what is the shop floor needing? Again, we've actually had a really good announcement today as Circularize that we can publicly share that we're working with Honda. Press release is out today where they're actually looking at, okay, we have to do this digital product passport for batteries, but what can this type of digital system enable us to do down the stream and also at the shop floor? So then the question really starts to move to what data points do they really need to perform the specific actions? And then this brings what I would say the utility of the digital product passport and all the data. I also agree with Magnus in the chat where he said data transparency is the easy part, making it understandable and relevant to the user is the tricky part. So actually, this is one of the values that we've seen within some of the projects that we've worked on. There are a lot of assumptions from upstream actors, as Deborah mentioned. Normally, we know who our direct downstream or upstream actor is, but we don't know what the actor 4 or 5 tiers down needs to actually improve their operations. So when I'm in the room, I usually try to get down to a point of what's the exact data point needed to make a diagnostic, operational, or strategic decision. And if the data doesn't serve one of those purposes beyond the compliance issue, then we're really only just looking at it from a compliance only. This is when the further light bulbs start to go on for those actors, because they start to then go back to their operation teams and say, okay, we have to build these digital systems for this and this reason. But actually, what are the other things that we're maybe missing? I'm not saying that we're fully there yet, because it's, digital systems are still being put into place. But this, for me, is where that lens gets more hyper-focused on the potential ROI of creating these systems, and then going into how do we collect material back, recover, etc., and all of the examples that Deborah gave. I don't know if that answers the question, Judith, or if there's other questions from the chat that people would like to ask, but back to you.
Thank you. I think it does, and we'll dive a bit deeper in the ROI. Congratulations on Honda. I have for Deborah maybe the opposite question. Deborah, can you share an example where a company has decided not to invest in transparency because of this logic, because it didn't make sense in the end?
Yes, many, and I won't name them because it often sits inside of a gray area where if you're not truly required to do it, or maybe you pay a fine if you don't do it, some companies choose to pay the fine because it's actually much less expensive than trying to put in a system like this. I would actually challenge that transparency is the easy part. The stats are that 15% of supply chains can see past their tier 1. So that's their supplier, and only 2% can see beyond that point. So if we again say that a t-shirt has 6 tiers, that means the retailer doesn't know what's happening. The best retailers in the world can barely see 3 tiers back. And so then for us to say, okay, transparency is easy, I fully disagree. Once it leaves the dock door of whatever part of the supply chain that you're managing, it's gone. Very few circumstances require and even support the ability to be able to have that transparency. And so the investment is actually huge in both in partnerships, sometimes purchasing of your own data. And I think we start to see a bit of a balance. We have tension between right to repair and the right to ownership. Hey, if I bought a product, mind your own business, it's mine now, versus extended producer responsibility that says, okay, it's not your product anymore, but actually you're held accountable for what the consumer or the user does to it. And I think we can't have both. I think if it's yours, it's yours. And if it's not, it's not. And I don't mean to be black and white on it, but I find that DPPs fall in this spectrum of who has the right to see the data and what are they going to do with it afterwards. And this again is where this spectrum of circumstances is very helpful, because sometimes if we're just going to reuse it and we need it to get back to like new or like good enough to hold a liquid or to resale or whatever the circumstance might be. So I could rattle off several companies who don't, but it ultimately becomes, this is much, much harder than people realize. And I actually think that this new requirement out of the EU is impossible to comply with because of how supply chains are structured and how they work. Companies like Phil's give folks the best chance to do it. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the lift it is in order to get, it's not like it's, if I say 6 tiers, it's not 6 companies, because each tier might have 2, 5, 10, 1,000 suppliers. So very quickly for the household goods, again, that's around you right now, you might have thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of suppliers in that supply chain, which is very difficult to try to wrangle.
Yeah, and maybe let's double click a bit on that, and we're off to our first disagreement. So I'm excited already. Can you maybe share both, and I'll start with you, Deborah, how big this gap is between what the policy, maybe even industry discourse assumes about DDPs and transparency and what you're actually seeing in practice?
It's a very large gap. And this, Judith, is where you heard me opine on that podcast, which is we actually put ourselves in this circumstance. The circularity community has self-volunteered that we should provide all of this information in order for people to trust these products. This is not, and I'm gonna go on recording here. This is not possible to do fully in any supply chain, unless it is like at your farmer's market and you bought a carrot from the farmer, then it's pretty good. But what about the fertilizer? What about the soil? What about the seeds? What about the repairs for the tractors that were on those farms? We actually don't know where that all came from, and the farmer doesn't either. And so when we think about the breadth and the complexity, I think supply chain is just the coolest profession to be in, because the fact that anything works at all is amazing to me, given how loosely these compliance relationships work along the chain. But I'll give you an example that is a close cousin to DPPs, which is a big fight in the US right now, which is tariffs and country of origin. Where did something get made? And get made often means the last step to add value. So if you purchase a bag from China and you add a zipper in the United States, you can claim it's made in the US. But it wasn't actually made in the US. The pieces and components were made in many, many different countries and put together. If we think about adding up the components on everyday items, the jeans that you're wearing right now went 40,000 miles if you add up the thread and the zipper and the dyes, et cetera. And your cell phone went all the way to the moon. So if we think about the complexity of these, that's what the US right now is really attention. And I speak with companies who are trying to figure out how to identify country of origin. And interestingly, I've also spoken with the government who is having the same challenge. How do I help my frontline workers at the border to understand where did this thing come from? And is this paperwork correct? And how do I validate this? So we're actually seeing two sides, both trying to get to the right answer, and neither side capable of doing that because supply chains are so complex and the rules around origin or use, and this calls into the need for standards. I know that's one thing that Phil and I absolutely agree on, is the need for standards and how we define what is use, what is a part, what is a component, what is highest value, what is like new, and so forth. So anyhow, I think that's an interesting close cousin. So even though the US is feeling a deregulated state, we're having an increase in requirement on visibility around tariffs, which underlying has the same capability.
Thanks for highlighting also the tariffs. Maybe Phil, does that gap resonate with you, and how do you also solve it in practice? And you apparently also have the coolest profession in the world, so that's also not bad either.
Oh, well, I can't profess to be a supply chain professional. I came in through the circular economy route. Deborah's got the credence and credibility on that over me tenfold. But I do fully agree with what Deborah's describing. I think policy discourse in on itself sees supply chains as frictionless and digital threads. Even Sven, you've mentioned in the chat that material transparency and global automotive is the easy part as they all operate within the same data ecosystem. I'm not sure which data system you're describing. I've seen organizations within their own organizations operating across different digital systems from different manufacturing sites set up in different ways. And to Deborah's point, they sometimes even use different terminology for processes and or steps within their own production. So it's not very straightforward or simple. To go to the question though that Judith asked, what are we seeing in practice versus the current gap and the actions that are needed? I mean, I think policy is trying to assess or set a set of regulations and rules that can be dependent across all value chains. And this is really, really challenging because different value chains operate in different ways. What we're also seeing as well is companies that are entirely focused on the technical compliance of generating data aren't also connecting those to the decisions that are actually going to help their organizations going forward. So I think what I'm looking at, and we've actually been part of some case studies with the European Union as dialogues as part of the policy engagement. So ourselves and I think 17 other organizations operating within digital supply chains brought a load of examples to policymakers to try and bring a narrative of what is actually the problem in industry. And there are open public consultations, so they're trying to learn. So that's on the one side. The other side, which is as well from the industry lens, I think industry has basically said, okay, if we're transparent, that means I need to build out a really thick data file for every single process that I'm doing, which means that it then becomes, and Deborah even said, and I think correctly so, that sometimes they'll just be, okay, if the data file is so big, we'll just take the fine, just because it's easier for us to do. So I think there has to be something in the middle where we start looking at the additional value that the data can have, understanding the strategic choices that are required along the value chain. And specifically, like, we don't need to collect data for data's sake. We need to come to smart measurement and actually understanding what data will trigger both the industry to actually move into the direction of travel that regulations want to come. I think Deborah's point around tariffs is really, really valid. We had a bunch of organizations come to us saying, we now need to provide this level of granularity on the aluminium or steel that we're bringing into the US. We had an example of a company cannot mention whom, but they had shipping containers full of product that was held at port until they paid certain tariffs, and they had no idea how to do to bring that level of granularity to that. So that's a financial decision. So that sits in your profit and loss, and that really makes these type of data questions more of a tangible financial issue. So I think we'll come to a happy middle ground where policy and regulation and industry find what is sensible. I don't think we're quite there yet. That's not fully exactly how to fill the gap. It's just that there is a gap, and we're kind of going incrementally into the middle.
The journey is the destination in a way as well. Great question in the chat on physical evidence that we'll jump in a bit, but maybe let's move first from problem to also the good side, the solutions. Where are you actually seeing transparency create also real business value, maybe new revenue, stronger margins, better customer relationships? Deborah, can you inspire us first, please?
Yes, certainly. In the land of reuse and circularity, the best stories are coming to us either from within one brand. Automotive is usually ahead here, and Phil rattled off several names. Toyota doing incredible things, BMW, Renault has been there for a long time, and Honda, as was announced today by Circularize. And so they're an interesting one to watch, but also have some advantages and disadvantages. Cars are very complicated. But because they're an OEM, they also are able to put forth a certain level of quality control, which can help to track. Also, many parts inside of a car are serialized. So they have like a stamp, like either a batch or a unique number. That also helps us in repair because then we know what it is. It already has a passport number of sorts, even if that passport hasn't been tracked in the same system. Mm-hmm. But when we look at other industries, it becomes a little bit more difficult to understand where an item has been. And again, we need to figure out, does it matter? If a coffee grinder is still functioning, for example, does it matter how many times it's been used, or even if a part has been swapped out? Philips, famously ahead of the game, always out ahead in the land of circular economy, have proven they can now economically viably repair an electric toothbrush, not the head, of course, but the body part, which are not very expensive to buy. And so that's very optimistic for me that you can take a relatively inexpensive, almost commoditized item, and we've switched into land of being able to repair it. I personally have been holding on to a suitcase that's been broken for 2.5 years, and I really want to repair the zipper. I love the suitcase, but it still is too expensive to do at my local shop. So we have some good examples that are showcasing. The others come from close relationships. So if it's not inside one brand, it's big announcements coming between a few brands. The other call out I'll give is that we are seeing technology assist competitors. So if we think about the land of big items like cars or Caterpillar, the big items that need these spare parts, those are kept by companies called dealers, and often they compete. They always compete with each other. And so sometimes you see bad behavior. Dealers are going to over purchase on certain items because they want to make sure that they have it for their customers. But some technology is coming in to provide joint transparency for the OEM. So Caterpillar, for example, could work with these independent dealers and see all of their inventory at one time, and then can offer incentives for dealers to sell the inventory to each other, which actually works, because if it's about getting your technician and the part and the big machine all available at the same time, it's actually very difficult to do that. And so if there's a premium you pay on the part to have it available, and the alternative is that something is down and it costs you $1 million an hour if it's down, then companies are going for that. So there are definitely areas where this is happening, but do want to caution that what we've chewed off here is a tall mountain to climb, but we're going to do it a step at a time.
I love that. Phil, do you have any other inspirational business value examples to add to that?
Yeah, I won't add on because I think Deborah's given a very good overview there. What I would say is, so there's choices that OEMs and supply chains in general need to make, and specifically the brands, around whether they choose a closed or open loop for recovery activities, whether they're reuse, repair, refurbishment, and ultimately end-of-life recovery. I think those OEMs and brands that will benefit the most over the coming period will be those that will act as orchestrators. What do I mean by orchestrators? And it's what Deborah mentioned about the types of collaborations and partnerships. So they will be the ones who provide clean and actionable data. And I think that was a comment made earlier. Providing the data is one thing, making it clean and actionable is the other. So if I give an example, if I take the lens of an end consumer engaging with a brand, the argument is around what information is relevant to that consumer, to that customer, to make a purchasing choice. And then once they've got that product, so Deborah mentioned about she wants to fix the zip on her suitcase. So how can she best engage with that brand to extend that product lifetime of the suitcase that she already has? So this can create brand loyalty. This can support also market differentiation for the brand. So that's one area. So how can a brand orchestrate a partnership where Deborah can then say, okay, my suitcase is broken. Yes, of course, Deborah, your suitcase can be picked up by XYZ actor who can fix it with the parts. And then ergo sum, she can travel again with the same suitcase. If I then take the lens of an ultimate end-of-life downstream recovery partner, so somebody really taking the materials apart, could this be, and Deborah mentioned it before, the exchange of data, clean and actionable data, for rights for return of those valuable secondary materials? Now, again, Deborah mentioned tariffs. This is another interesting area that we're seeing, that if the product is already within a country, or at least the material in the product that is a waste product or end-of-life product, can I then recover that in country, and therefore I'm not facing gate fees at the point of ports for tariffs because that material has come from within this country? So there are some of these value propositions that are building. But again, this requires those companies to move beyond purely compliance and really looking at how they can action and operationalize product lifetime extension and potential future feedstock security strategies. So it takes the system to a higher level. And I just noticed in the chat, by the way, because I tie into it, the key question around DPPs being rolled back because of complexity for Omnibus and also the data package. This is a working concern. Sarah, I don't think there is one answer. What we are aware of is that due to the range of Omnibus effects, the likelihood is that they will not be rolled back in the same scenario. What we understand, and again, this is not T's crossed and I's dotted, but there cannot be yet another omnibus because this will then reduce the direction of travel and understanding. It might be some adaptations still, but there's been so many omnibuses come out in 2025 that our assumption and understanding is that the regulations will still be going forward. That said, there is a full review in September and announcements that will be going forward. So yeah, cannot give a direct answer to that, but to Ashley's point around LCA, yes, all of this information would be super valuable if it was accessible. Also for product carbon footprinting, which is the rules that are coming out also, again, for batteries as well. Sorry to take a bit longer, but I thought I'd try to answer those. Judith, back to you.
Thanks so much. If only we could look into the future, but I guess that's our best guess for now. A question in the chat I also really appreciated is, how do we explain a normal customer that this product is a good choice, and maybe especially the toothbrush in mind? How would we do that, Deborah?
Yeah. So I'll fess up here. My true love in this game is actually industrial space, business to business. If we think about where our materials are being used, it's actually in B2B upstream rather than to consumers. But the consumer gets a lot of attention, I think, because we are all consumers. And so it's more relatable. But keep that in mind, that as we think about the mass use of material and the mass waste that's produced, it's actually upstream in that supply chain that we can't see. One of the best practices, of course, that we've seen is from like a Patagonia. And so they are famous for their repair workshops, but they also place reused items next to the new items on the shelf. So as you're flipping through to go shopping and you see something that is used that could be there at the same time, or even in Amazon, as we look, I know Amazon can be a range of reactions from folks, but their reuse marketplace is very strong, and they give you a condition and they'll give you an OEM guarantee often. And so as you make the choice abundantly obvious to a consumer, you go where they are already. then we can start to integrate these parts back into reuse. I also imagine a future, perhaps overly optimistic, where just like we have coffee shops on every corner, that these repair shops that are currently really cell phone focused, a little kiosk to fix your broken screen when you drop your phone. I'm very hopeful that we see repair shops that can do more than that. They can fix the little whir thing on your blender because your blender only cost you $30, and so can I fix it for less than that? That becomes the challenge, and I think we have to push repair closer to the point of use. And then the balance, of course, becomes people need to make a workable wage, a livable wage, and also be able to repair something quicker than a full hour, let's say. And that's, again, where we get to that third circumstance in the framework. How do we get information to the repair technician so that they can make that repair as quickly as possible and make it economically viable? So I think it's an interesting one. I always go back to operations because I am on the supply chain. So when we think about transparency, even with something like carbon, for example, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago that was carbon through a supply chain lens, because even understanding the carbon footprint, what do we do with that information? Okay, it's a kilo, 8 kilos, 100 kilos. So what? How do you then take that to reduce it? You've got to go back into the supply chain and figure out what's the action that's happening in order to impact that. And I think similarly with material use, we'll end up with a similar type of a rule of thumb of how can we make something more repairable and more usable that will complement a full DPP. Similar, again, close cousins with the carbon discussion. It's great to have every single last detail, but at the end of the day, unless we know where exactly we're asking someone to change a behavior in order to do what, then it's data without an action that comes behind it.
Got it. I hope that answered the question on the consumer side. Thanks, Deborah. I saw a nod from Phil, so I'm assuming he agrees. Phil, anything to add, or would you like to venture into the question next?
I agree in so much as on my PhD journey, I did my topic was how to facilitate collaborative innovation for circular economy, and there was a post-it note on my screen for all 4 years, which is where does the consumer fit in, and I never got close to answering it. So I think it's still a working topic. But what I would say is that there is that aspect that a lot of times those actors, the downstream side is actually missing from some of those discussions. And I'd like bring it to one of the biggest learnings that we've experienced within Circularize, which is a lot of the time we have to bring together collaborative projects within proof of concepts because this type of logic and type of data sharing is new to most organizations. The value and the return of investment is still questioned. Hence what we've been describing here, going beyond compliance. And there's a lot of assumptions that actors have around what is actually going to be operationally sticky, what is going to move the needle. So what we've done in the past, and we've learned from when we're doing these collaborative projects, is really bringing people into the room together to understand, what is the level of granularity of information, data, information, same thing, that's needed to move the needle. So if we take a DPP specification at end of life, it would be great if we could start working backwards, understand, okay, if I'm going to perform operation X or Y, what are the key points that we need? Make those accessible. And again, to the point that was made, make them accessible and usable and actionable so that specific action can be done, and probably strip away a lot of the noise. I also saw Deborah's comments about the regulation, and I fully agree that it's most likely going to be more achievable in this time frame. Vis-a-vis, there won't be another omnibus, but we need to make it more achievable. And one way to do that is to find out, okay, what is actually the value of doing these actions? So I think if we see this also from the EU's lens, again, talking EU because that's our home base, there is a push for strategic autonomy, specifically around valuable materials. Okay, so if we're increasingly seeing that security and recovery, then we need to start looking at the investment. So what are the investors needing to deploy capital? This was also one of Deborah's key points that was brought in the discussion that we started. There are certain hard physical skills that need to be brought in, specifically for product lifetime extension and recovery. So what data does a capital market need to allocate investment to start building repair centers, logistics hubs? How can we actually start supporting that? Can we then build that in? That's one side. The other point as well around consumers and their actual ability to decide. am I comparing apples with oranges or apples and apples? We see this in Circularize a little bit like the food labeling system. So if you'd have gone back 30 years ago, it was the Wild West. Anything could be put on packages. You could get, information about the sugar, maybe. But then we came to a simple to read, understand, traffic light system. Green is healthy, red is unhealthy. It makes it a lot easier for consumers. So I don't think we're quite there yet. But I would say, how to frame it, bringing that learning by doing. And I think this is what we'll see. Also, Sven was mentioning in the chat, are there lessons to learn from automotive? Most likely there will be. Again, automotive will come under the first regulation of batteries under the battery passport. There's probably going to be a lot of information that can be learned and areas that we can actually build on that for other sectors to get to the data that's important to become operationally sticky. I think that adds to it, but I don't know, Judith, this is a follow-up or further questions to go into.
No, sounds good. I think that's super helpful. And maybe building on that, also in the chat, when do companies usually realize that a DDP is not just digital labor or compliance? And then what is the hardest part to solve once they have reached that point?
I'm happy to jump in first, and then Deborah, probably from your side, over to you. But I'm sorry for the academic answer, but it kind of depends. It depends who's in the room. So if the company is purely looking at it from compliance, the conversation will stay there for a very long time. If we start to talk about the operations that they're bringing in, and you have somebody who's more of a longer term thinker, strategic thinker, and or their role is function to that, then they start to look more broadly around it. When you get digital strategy or teams, and more of those are being developed in larger organizations, then you start to get conversations around business model, you start to get conversations around the understanding of the ROI of this. I don't think there's a single aha moment for any single organization. One of the ways that I've looked at this as well is when I try to challenge companies and say, okay, so do you have 2030 or 2050 targets? And a lot of the time they're like, yeah, we want this rate of recycled content in our materials by 2030. We want to be net zero by 2050. Then my question will be, okay, so how are you tracking that batch on batch, production run by production run? How are you engaging with your suppliers around understanding if they can service those needs going forward? Have you done any risk assessment based upon those suppliers? Have you started to engage with those suppliers that this is even achievable? Question. And then you start to see those moments come together and you say, well, these are things that you can include in a digital solution, not specifically a DPP, but a digital solution where you're collecting information from your suppliers and you're building that into product level traceability. Again, it's not that we've answered those questions yet. I think there's still a long level of learning to do, but I'll pass over. Deborah, you've got things to add on this, I'm sure.
Boy, do I. Look, again, I'll introduce a close cousin. Most supply chain professionals are not familiar with the term DPP. It was born from sustainability and circularity often, and sometimes created without, I think, the advice of operations professionals because of the challenge and the uphill battle that it introduces for us to comply to. Now, what the supply chain community has attempted to do for a very long time has been, in the name of risk and resiliency, to look upstream in our supply chains to understand, do I have risk in my supply base? Some supply chains, for example, they will do all the work to get to the third tier. And again, remember, that's less than 2% of supply chains can see that far back. And they'll say, Eureka, we've done it. We have 3 different suppliers for our key components. So if something happens, a fire, a flood, a border, a closure, a purchase, we'll be able to continue operating. But if we look further, often those 3 different options all buy from the same spot. So the resiliency that it appears that you have is actually back together again. So I bring that up because the question of when do we see that it's an operational transformation, it comes back to, again, there's nobody charged in the supply chain. Very few supply chains have complete control or vertical integration. Almost no one does, because again, remember that some of these industrial supply chains might have 100,000 direct suppliers, tier 1, and each of those might have hundreds of thousands of suppliers. And so you again get to millions of companies today that's static. tomorrow, some of those company choices might change because they changed their supply base and they found a better price or a different location. So you might do all the work to map all of these pathways, and tomorrow it's different. And so to capture the dynamic nature of supply chain, this living, breathing organism, is quite difficult to do. And I haven't even talked about downstream then. So what happens again when I leave my dock door? I actually often legally no longer lay claim to that product unless I'm leasing it, which introduces a whole separate discussion. So again, I feel a bit like a broken record, but really want this point to be driven home that our supply chains are these huge, huge entities. And so in order to say, look, we need all of this information, can be an uphill battle. Now, the plug I'll give is, if we don't try to apply a DPP to a virgin supply chain of something we've built brand new, and instead we collapse our supply chains and repair more than we build new, and we have relationships with our repair vendors like Phil outlined, then this becomes easier. We pick it up from the user, we repair it, and we drop it back off again. Spare parts, we might still have the challenge of where did it come from and how was it made, but even those are starting to be refurbished. And again, the automotive community is starting to show us certified pre-owned parts as the next phase behind certified pre-owned vehicles. And they are harvesting and reconditioning those themselves. So as we start to think about how do we make this long supply chain easier, we collapse it, we bend it, we make it into a circle. That, of course, is the premise behind the circular economy. Our job in visibility becomes easier, and tagging a repair to a DPP becomes much more straightforward than trying to get this whole line mapped.
Thank you, Deborah. And I think the question from Blythe, I hope I don't butcher your name, in the chat, kind of builds on the virgin material question. Mineral leasing in perpetuity, minerals as a service. Is that technically possible with the design of current DPPs, Phil?
With the design of a current DPP, no, but from a digital solution standpoint, technically, yes, it's possible. The question I'd ask is it fully desirable for all of those organizations? For instance, if we're talking ore is finite, is the processing of that ore into ingots or cabling or sheets in the country of origin for ore? Question mark. I mean, there are possibilities there. Let's say that the ore producing nations want to say, we would like a fair cut of the downstream processing and potential recovery of that, maybe. And they could then invest over a longer period of time into the productive capacity of recovering that material. Because again, going from ore to material and then back in, as Deborah said, closing the loop. Yeah, so would it be minerals as a service? I don't know, but the digital side is definitely possible. Whether it's a viable, scalable model, I have no idea. I don't know, Deborah, if you've come across this at all, from material back again into ore. Question, thoughts?
Persistent IDs, yes, actually, technically this is possible. It is prohibitively expensive currently, but it is actually possible. I encourage you to look up GS1. They hold the standard for persistent IDs. So every time that you check out of the checkout stand and the thing goes beep, and that's a GS1 barcode. Can you imagine if everybody made their own barcode and it would never work out? That's been around for 70 years, almost 80 years by now. And they have some interesting guidance and early perspectives on the ability to tag, I'm not a scientist here, everybody, to tag specific materials. And so you can watch that through a lifetime. How it works, I'm not a scientist, but again, it's prohibitively expensive. So yes, you could do that. But again, why would we do that? Yes, we don't have very much of this material left. And I suspect that is why China's DPPs are becoming so mature, because China has a hold on critical materials in the world. And I suspect they want to make that hold even better. But each of us should, our supply chain should, our community should, our country should, our region should. We should be starting to think about the criticality of these limited resources, which again, the underlying premise of the circular economy. How do we take better care of these materials? Because we can't take it from the earth forever. We're going to have to take it from each other, share, do our parts, reuse, and figure out how to recycle and reman our way into being able to function as a society.
Thank you for bringing in also the China point. I think Andres also mentioned it in the chat. I think the motivations or the drivers could help explain what you just mentioned. Trish is going to launch our quick poll for our last, before we let you go, to kind of reflect on, from everything you've heard today in the 5 scenarios that you now are a bit more familiar with, which of these from the framework best describe where your organization is right now? Is it the liability handoffs, network coordination, repair at scale, end of life recovery, or high volume flows? We'd love to hear your vote, which hopefully is now on your screen. With that, we have 3 minutes left. I am a ruthless timekeeper. So I'll give one final breath to Phil and Deborah to round us up today. Deborah.
When we think about introducing data into an operation, I encourage us again to think about who are we giving what data to, and what are we asking them to change or do differently with that data.
Fantastic long breath. Thank you. Phil, final words from your side.
To build on what Deborah said, everything is theoretically and hypothetically possible, but bringing it into operational reality is a very long road. So keep it simple, stupid. Start with the problem that is at hand. And yeah, the nicer, big, grand vision and ideas we can definitely work on. From a technical point of view, digital, a lot is possible. Whether it's viable, feasible, and desirable, and will actually solve a real world problem, I think is the starting question that we should all ask ourselves.
Fully agree, and hopefully we made the long road a bit shorter by today's webinar. I'm going to hand it over back to Trish for the closing, and thanks everyone for the great discussion also in the chat. Really appreciate it. Trish, over to you.
Yes, exactly. I just like to thank everybody. The chats that were coming in, very lovely questions, and it really helped the speakers also get on board and also express a lot of things that ideally they might not have touched upon. So thank you everybody for joining us, and you can listen back. We will be sending the recording to everybody. So have fun and have a nice day.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much. Lovely to see you all.
Thanks from my side, guys. All the best.
All the speakers also, Deborah, Judith. Thank you so much.
With pleasure.